Hello, and welcome to Grasping Reason, a channel about history, philosophy, and art. This time in our series on the Pre-Socratics, Zeno of Elea. Zeno is well known as the author of many paradoxes that have survived to today. We have an approximate date for Zeno's birth of 490 BCE, thanks to Plato's dialogue Parmenides, which in turn suggests he had written his book before the age of 40, which is roughly when the imagined meeting that takes place in that dialogue was happening. He is the second of our Pre-Socratics from the Greek colony of Elea on the southwestern coast of the Italian peninsula, and he is firmly associated with a particular school of philosophy, the Eleatic school, that comes from that city. While some of the schools of thought that are described for the Pre-Socratic seem like dubious categorizations at best, that isn't the case here. The teacher-pupil relationship with the older Parmenides seems to be widely accepted as true, and probably thanks in large part to that Platonic dialogue, in which both thinkers appear, both get to speak, and Zeno is explicitly charged with working to shore up the ideas of Parmenides. We'll see that characterization of Zeno is a little misleading, but it does place Zeno within a broader philosophical movement, which his own writings don't readily do. Of those writings, we are afforded only 3 extant fragments that are considered to be Zeno's own words, appearing in a work by Simplicius almost a millennia later, that was ostensibly an analysis of Aristotle's work. Other than those fragments, we have Aristotle to thank, also, for the testimonies of Zeno that provides us with the other paradoxes. While Aristotle worked to argue against Zeno's paradoxes and the supposed truths they expound, he also became our source for his words. That should be kept in mind, of course. Zeno is presented to us through the lens of a critic, so we should expect an imperfect communication. Yet it is to Aristotle's credit that we can still, for the most part, tackle Zeno's paradoxes without feeling railroaded into Aristotle's own position on them. Let us now start this video properly and take a look at these paradoxes. I'll start with the 4 paradoxes of motion, as I believe they are probably the most well known of Zeno's paradoxes. They are, all 4, provided by Aristotle as testimonies, and concern motion and change. Before I go on, I want to note that the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's article on Zeno's paradoxes gives slightly different names for these paradoxes than the SEP article on Zeno himself, and also the other sources I have used. The difference lies in the first and fourth paradoxes. While most sources name the first paradox either the dichotomy or the stadium, and the fourth the moving rose, the SEP article on Zeno's paradoxes names the fourth the stadium. It is not an inappropriate name for the fourth paradox, but I'll be following the other sources on this occasion. So, the 4 paradoxes of motion are the dichotomy or the stadium, Achilles and the tortoise, the arrow, and finally the moving rose. So, starting with the dichotomy. Imagine a stadium with a finite length, and a runner that stands at one end with the aim of running the full length. To reach the end, the runner must first run halfway towards the end. To run halfway, the runner must run halfway to halfway. In fact, to run any division of the full length, the runner must always first run a fraction of that division. Each division can always be divided further, and that further division must first be arrived at by the runner before the complete run is close to being made. Kirk, and Schofield in their The Pre-Socratic Philosophers gave us a reasonable breakdown of the argument presented by Zeno, which can be useful to us here. 1. To reach his goal, a runner must touch infinitely many points ordered in the sequence 1/2, 1/4, 1/8, etc. It is impossible to touch infinitely many points in a finite time, so the runner cannot reach his goal. If the spatial distance of the stadium is being infinitely divided, then the first point that the runner must first run to becomes a vanishingly smaller and smaller distance, continually divided even beyond the point of being seemingly no distance at all. With this in mind, how can the runner even begin the race, let alone finish it? The conclusion we are being asked to arrive at here is that motion in fact does not exist, or perhaps that motion does not happen. This is a paradox when put aside the common sense notion that, of course, motion happens. Now, if you look at this paradox with an eye to solving it, you might already have an idea of how to do that, and I would put money on that solution involving some formulation of the question, why are we allowing a finite spatial distance to be infinitely divided, and not allowing a finite temporal distance to be equally infinitely divided? It certainly appears as if Zeno is comfortable with a spatial distance being at once finite and infinite. Then, what is the problem with saying the same of a temporal distance? This is a concern raised also by Aristotle. The SEP article on the paradoxes explains, and here they name the runner Atalanta. Thus, each fractional distance has just the right fraction of the finite total time for Atalanta to complete it, and thus the distance can be completed in a finite time. Now, I personally believe that if your aim is to resolve the paradox, then this is the first step to do so. The completion of running the set spatial distance requires a set temporal distance, which can also be split into infinite divisions. If you allow that a finite distance, spatial or temporal, can also at once be considered an infinity, then the paradox is solved. If you won't allow this, then Zeno's own use of this principle for spatial distance should also be disallowed, and the paradox becomes flawed and can be dismissed as nonsense. I should mention, however, that my brain is so small that when it bounces off the side of my skull, there is an audible echo, so it's foolish to think that I could be giving you a satisfactory answer to the paradox. Aristotle certainly does not consider the problem solved in this way. He goes on to distinguish between a potential infinity of a finite space that could be infinitely divided, and the actual infinity of the infinite series of fractions that make up a finite space. The potentially infinite space is traversable in a finite time, while the actually infinite series of fractions cannot be touched in sequence within a finite time. This all seems to lead to the complex theory of mathematical infinities then, and the paradox recedes into the background as mathematical theories take centre stage. I'll be making this point later too, but it's worth pointing out here that this is why Zeno's paradoxes are still relevant today. The paradox can be picked apart and dismantled, but the questions it leads us to are still relevant and forceful after that. The second paradox of motion is that of Achilles and the tortoise, or just simply the Achilles. In a race between Achilles and a tortoise, the slow-moving tortoise has a head start. Can the faster Achilles ever catch up to the tortoise? First, Achilles must meet the distance that the tortoise is at the start of the race, but by the time he gets there, the tortoise has already moved on. Achilles, then, must meet the tortoise's new position, but again, by the time he meets that position, the tortoise has again moved on. This is taken to show that Achilles may never actually catch up to the tortoise. Now, the sharp-eyed among you will already have noticed that this is really just the same problem as the first paradox of motion. If you haven't seen that, then it's possibly because here the race does not have an explicit finite spatial distance, but the conditions of this paradox are met when Achilles catches up to the tortoise. That is a finite distance, determined by the higher velocity of Achilles compared to the tortoise, so that in the common sense understanding of the world, Achilles will obviously catch up to a tortoise travelling at a slower speed, and at that point, the spatial distance is set as finite. Given that these two paradoxes are essentially the same then, you can take either to lead you to the same questions. Obviously, one paradox has a tortoise, so the choice between the two is already really decided for you. The third paradox of motion is known as the arrow. Consider an arrow, apparently in motion at any instant. First, Zeno assumes that it travels no distance during that moment. It occupies an equal space for the whole instant, but the entire period of its motion contains only instants, all of which contain an arrow at rest, and so Zeno concludes the arrow cannot be moving. I like this paradox a lot for the questions inherent in it. Consider the statement, the arrow is moving. The word is in that statement is commonly assumed to refer to simply a single instant, a present now, in which the predicate, moving, applies to the subject, arrow. But if motion does not happen in any instant, then does our statement now make no sense? If we accept that motion does not happen in an instance, then we must either redefine the word moving to mean stasis, or redefine the word is to not simply suggest a single instant. Perhaps we can expand its definition to also include the successive moments before and after the now. The paradox doesn't seem to go exactly so far, but these questions appear to me to be inherent within it. For any instant of time, the arrow occupies a spatial dimension exactly equal to itself. This terminology is important, as we are assumed to believe that any phenomenal object can only occupy a spatial dimension equal to itself. To say otherwise is to suggest that a thing can be in multiple places at once. Unless you're a quantum physicist, or Pythagoras, that should be considered an inappropriate suggestion. If a thing does not move in any instant, and if time is a constant succession of instants, then the arrow is never moving. Each instant represents a movement of exactly 0 units. A time period is an infinite succession of instants, each representing 0 units of movement. Adding an infinite series of zeros still equates to 0, so the arrow never moves. Now, if solving this paradox is your aim, then you may be able to reach a definition of motion or being that satisfies this aim. But whether we can solve the paradox or not is really besides the point. Zeno has again presented us with a problem that leads only to complicated answers. Our common sense understanding of the world, and of motion in particular, must be put aside to resolve the paradox. The final paradox of motion is the moving rows. Imagine you have 3 identically sized rows of objects, the A's, the B's, and the C's. The row of A's is in a fixed position in the centre of some arena. The row of B's sits at the left end of the arena, and the row of C's sits at the right end, each just outside the dimensions of row A. The row of B's and the row of C's move towards their respective opposite ends of the arena, with a velocity that is constant, and the same for the rows of B's and the rows of C's, while the row of A's remains stationary. When the final object in the row of B's, the object on the very left of the row, has passed all of the objects in the row of C's, then it will only have reached the halfway point past the row of A's. This is used to suggest that one of the moving rows is travelling as fast as itself, and also half as fast as itself. This paradox is quite difficult to explain in words alone, so if you are watching the video, you probably have a better understanding of what I just said. If not, I can only apologise because I can't seem to put this paradox into any clearer words. The purpose of this paradox is almost as unclear though. Is Zeno really suggesting that an object moves both as fast as and half as fast as itself? And is he attempting to prove this by using sets of objects that are in a distinct state of motion, one at rest, one moving? I have to admit that I simply can't make any possible intention of Zeno here make any sense to myself. For that, some of the blame must lie with Aristotle, who doesn't state the entire paradox fully, only seemingly arguing against the way he poorly describes it. On this matter, the SEP's article on Zeno states, "Unfortunately, the evidence for this particular paradox does not enable us to determine just how Zeno may in fact have argued. Aristotle thinks the argument depends upon a transparent falsehood, and one must therefore keep in mind, if it seems he was right, that Aristotle's presentation and reconstruction may itself be coloured by his desire to bear out this accusation. Effort is made by other sources to try and formulate a convincing paradox out of the mere suggestion of one provided by Aristotle. But with the concrete evidence provided, we seemingly can only say that either Zeno had no conception of relative motion, or that Aristotle did not present his ideas fairly. I can only assume that it is the latter. Each of the paradoxes of motion, and Aristotle includes this fourth under that category, sought to raise complex questions that defied a simple common sense understanding of motion. The first 3 of these paradoxes succeeded in raising those questions. The fourth only really succeeds in raising questions about the content of the paradox itself. Now we move on to the paradoxes for which we have extant fragments. These are, as the title of this section suggests, ostensibly about plurality, and they seek to establish the same point, namely, that a suggestion that many things exist is at least as absurd a suggestion as saying that only one thing exists. Let us take a look at one. If things are a many, they must just be as many as they are, and neither more nor less. Now, if they are as many as they are, they will be finite in number. If things are a many, they will be infinite in number, for there will always be other things between them, and others again between these, and so things are infinite in number. Here we are presented a complete paradox, with two conflicting statements pushing us to enter into complex questioning of their subject, the plurality of many existent things. If there is many things, then we must speak of them as a countable and finite number that satisfies their quantification as many. In this first argument, we are asked to look at this or that many. Yet, if there is a many, then it is defined by a distinction between objects that will always place another thing between those objects to keep them as distinct. Here, a passage from the SEP article on the paradoxes can help, wherein this paradox is named the argument from denseness. First, one might hold that for any pair of physical objects, two apples say, to be two distinct objects and not just one, a double apple, there must be a third between them, physically separating them, even if it is just air. This then necessitates an infinite number of objects between other objects, so that we are led to the conclusion that a many is necessarily an infinite quantity. We can see here that these paradoxes of plurality tackle the same issue as was evident in some of the paradoxes of motion, that of the relationship between the infinite and the finite in a single concept. The many must be both finite and infinite, if we accept both arguments of this paradox, and the suggestion of this as a paradox is that this is not an acceptable outcome. The other two fragments provided by Simplicius do not provide the full extent of the other paradox of plurality, and, taken together, take a long time to not give the full extent. In an attempt to put it more briefly then, the first fragment suggests that a distinguishable object in the many has a spatial dimension of magnitude and thickness. That is true of the object next to it, and of every other object. Adding the magnitudes of all these distinct objects will produce an entire magnitude of the many that is at least enormous, if not infinite, depending on whether you adopted the concept of the many as infinite from the first paradox of plurality. The second argument in this paradox is provided in a much clearer way than I can achieve by John Palmer, who wrote the SEP article on Zeno. Each of the many is the same as itself and one. Whatever has magnitude can be divided into distinguishable parts. Whatever has distinguishable parts is not everywhere the same as itself. Thus, whatever has magnitude is not everywhere, and so is not genuinely the same as itself. Whatever is not the same as itself is not genuinely one. Thus, whatever has magnitude is not genuinely one. Therefore, each of the many has no magnitude. So our two contradictory arguments for this paradox are that either the existence of many things produces a total of enormous, potentially infinite magnitude, or that the application of magnitude to the distinct objects of the many renders those objects no longer distinct objects of the many, and therefore, to preserve the many, we must say that the distinct objects have no magnitude. The many is suggested to be at once both extremely small and extremely large. Taken together, these two paradoxes suggest that there is something wrong with the common sense notion that there are many existent things. Because of this, they offer the best evidence that we have that Zeno worked to support the argument of his mentor, Parmenides. While saying that Parmenides was a monist is an arguable statement, saying that he sought to show that a plurality of existent things was in some sense illogical is, I believe, less arguable, and here we see Zeno demonstrating the same idea. But we shouldn't get ahead of ourselves and try to label Zeno. Throughout the paradoxes that survive today, the common theme seems less like a positive affirmation of a philosophical position and more like a rejection of the idea that philosophy can sufficiently answer any question. If we take him in isolation, he seems to be arguing only for the fallibility of a purely reason-based inquiry. Given the context of Zeno's relationship with Parmenides, the fact that both seem to argue against common-sense perceptions of the world can place them in a neat school of thought. Without reference to that context, however, Zeno can be taken alone without losing the forcefulness of the questions he lays bare, and it is these forceful questions that have lasted through the ages. The impact of the paradoxes appears to have been felt keenly at and around the time he was active. The Platonic dialogue Parmenides deals mostly with the subject that gives its title, yet Zeno is present, if only for long enough to have his own work indelibly linked to the work of his master. The firm association is not there unkind. Parmenides is clearly respected by Plato, but Zeno is not just mere side note to Parmenides' brilliance. Even before Plato, it appears that the way Zeno presented his arguments was respected among his peers, with an influence on the greater sophists of his age being certainly apparent. As is stated in the SEP article on Zeno, Zeno's influence on the great sophists who were his contemporaries, and, more generally, on the techniques of argumentation promulgated among the sophists, seems undeniable. The article goes on to specify both Protagoras and Gorgias, both subjects of other Platonic dialogues, as being especially influenced by the reductio ad absurdum argumentation style that the paradoxes present. Yet, while these sophists were treated much less kindly by Plato, we can't lump Zeno in with the people he influenced without marking a clear delineation between them. Zeno was nearly contemporaneous with these sophists, but he does come before them. Aristotle may have argued against the paradoxes that Zeno gave. What survives of Zeno is a beneficiary of that fact, but there was enough in the paradoxes for Aristotle to deem that necessary. Again, SEP gives us a neat summary of what this means. For Aristotle, then, Zeno was a controversialist and paradox-monger, whose arguments were, nevertheless, both sophisticated enough to qualify him as the inventor of dialectic, and were important for forcing clarification of concepts fundamental to natural science. So, even if Aristotle and other near-contemporaneous sources may not have appreciated the way Zeno had made his arguments, they still represented something that must take effort to work out, and only by leading their reader to uncomfortable questions about how we understand the world. These questions persisted too, long past the ancient age. Aristotle became the giant of Western philosophy during the Middle Ages, being rediscovered in Europe even before Plato, and while he brought Zeno with him in an explicit sense via his testimonies, I also think that the clarification of concepts that Zeno enforced can only have improved Aristotle's own writings. It is, outside the strict realm of philosophy, however, that Zeno has become most important in recent centuries. We've seen that the paradoxes raise significant questions about the nature of infinities, and that is an area of knowledge that we rarely see significant advancement in the modern age and since. Modern mathematics can help us to answer questions such as, can a distance be considered both finite and infinite? And what can this tell us about motion? Questions raised 2.5 millennia ago are still just as relevant to a modern mathematician, and it is for this main reason that Zeno himself is considered one of the most important pre-Socratic thinkers. As Kirk and Schofield, writing in the late 20th century, state, philosophers have never discussed the paradoxes more intensely than in our own century, ever since Russell succumbed to their fascination in its first decade. Of all the pre-Socratics, Zeno has most life in him today. It is a step too far to say that Zeno influenced modern mathematics. Mathematics is only ever influenced truly by the problems that the principles it discovers throws up. but Zeno sits among some of those principles. If we are to summarise Zeno's importance then, it is to say that here is a man living around 2,500 years ago that was raising significant questions about a common understanding of the world, and these questions would not find reasonable answers until significant advancements in our knowledge had been made. He is an unusual figure in pre-Socratic thought because it appears as if he is less concerned with propounding any particular theory, but rather suggesting the fallibility of not only our senses, but also of rational inquiry. In that sense, we can place him in the context of being pupil to Parmenides, but his importance is not at all defined by that context. I want to thank you all for watching this video. Please press all the good YouTube buttons to help the channel grow, and let me know whether I missed anything important about Zeno in the comments section. Until next time, goodbye.